All right, let's go ahead and do this. So um, today we're going to talk about estimation. So if we're looking at the GSBPM, we've moved now from, originally we're doing sort of the design, we were looking at 4.1 especially. So creating the frame and selecting the sample. We've passed now the collection. Last week we looked at edit and imputation, which is in the process column in section 5.4. We see edit and imputation. So now we're going to talk about calculating weights and calculating aggregates. So we now have this data that we're going to be able to do analysis on and provide to our clients or the general public. So what is estimation? So it's the extension of data collected from the sample to the population from which it was drawn. So we refer to this as inferential statistics. We're making inferences about the data that we've collected. So we collect from a small part of the population, and then we say, because this was done in a random method and certain protocols have taken place, we should be able to project this onto the entire population. So we're making inferences about the data we've collected. This is slightly different from descriptive statistics. So descriptive statistics is what happens when we are only describing what we see for the sample that we've drawn. So for example, Tracy and I live in a city of about 1 million people. If we did a sample of 1,000 people, the descriptive statistics would say, of the respondents who answered our survey, 32% feel a certain way. With inferential statistics, which is what we need weights for, we would then be able to take that sample of 1,000, project it onto the population of 1 million, and say, of the residents of the city of Ottawa, these are the findings that we have from our survey. So what we need to do is we need to calculate weights, and then we use these weights and the sample data to calculate estimates. So the weights are simply the number of units in the survey population that each sampled unit represents. So the step to calculate these weights are, we need to calculate a design weight, which we're going to see in the next couple slides. Then we're going to adjust for complete non-response. And if possible, we're then going to do some weighting adjustments for auxiliary information if we have any available. So let's just continue forward. So what is a design weight? The design weight is determined by the sample design. So this we can do before we calculate. It's the inverse of the probability of selection. So what I mean by that is, if we see this little example, for a simple random sample, if we had a population of 100, recall that the capital letters mean the population and the lowercase means the sample. So we're selecting 25 people out of 100, or 25 units out of 100 units. Then the probability of them being selected is 25 over 100, which is 1/4. And then the design weight is 4. If we have an equal probability sample design, so simple random sample is an example of equal probability sample. Certain systematic samples, if we're doing can have this happen. And a stratified sample where we're using n proportional allocation. So this goes back a couple of weeks now when we talked about how to allocate sample in a stratified sample. These will all have exactly the same probability for everyone selected. So imagine there are, I don't know, 100 of us in this presentation. There's 46 of us. If there's 46 of us in this presentation and I want to draw one person's name or 10 people's names, everyone would have an equal chance of being selected if I did it by simple random sampling. So everyone would have exactly the same design weight. So we could do all of our analysis and then just multiply it by whatever that weight is. So equal probability sample design gives everyone the same weight, which makes estimation very easy. So for example, here's an example with a stratified simple random sample with n proportional allocation. So we're allocating the sample proportional to the population. So in this one, we have 1,000 people in our population. We have 400 men and 600 women. And we see from the fourth column, the probability of selection here is 0.2. So we're selecting 80 of the 400 men and 120 of the 600 women. And each of these have a design weight, which is just 1 over 0.2, which gives us 5. So each of the sampled males will represent 5 other males, and each of the sampled females will represent 5 other females. And if we just do a straight multiplication, if we do 80 times 5, we see that we get back to our 400. And if we do 5 times 120, we see that we get to 600. So this is how weighting works. Each person, each unit in our sample, we multiply it by the design weight and we get back to our total. If there's an unequal probability of selection, then we have to calculate the probability of selection for each unit. So if we have stratified sample where there's disproportionate allocation, so recall I gave an example where we talked about people living in a city and people living in a country. We may want to boost up the number of people being interviewed who live in the city because it's less expensive to do face-to-face interviews. Their probability of selection is much higher, so their weight is much smaller because they don't have to represent as many people. So we have to calculate this for every single unit. And with probability proportional to size samples, if we recall that from a few weeks ago, I did an example where we talked about farms and the number of acres. Each farm had a different chance of being selected based on the number of acres that were in that farm. So we would have to calculate it for each one. So this gets a little bit trickier. So here's an easier one with unequal probability samples. So here was an example where we did urban and rural. So we decided to select 200 units from the urban 1,000 population and 50 from the 100 from the rural. So we've oversampled. We've sampled half of the rural population. We see that where the probability of selection is 0.5, when we only have 20% of the urban population being selected. So the design weights again reflect this. The design weight for the urban setting is 5, and for the rural setting is 2. So we just have to keep track of this while we're doing our analysis, and this will allow us to calculate inferential statistics on the entire population. If we didn't do this, what would happen is the rural answers would become too important. In other words, if we didn't attach a weight to this, and we said, okay, we had 250 respondents, the 50 of the 250, there's too many people from the rural area. So we would get more rural answers influencing the outcome of this. Imagine if we dropped down the sample size of the urban one from 1,000 down to 100, and we decided to do the rural, we selected all 100, we did a census, we did all 100. So that way we'd have 100 coming from urban and 100 coming from rural. Even though there's only 1,000, there's 1,000 in the urban setting and 100 in the rural setting, it would mean that each person's voice had an equal weight, even though the urban respondent represented 10 people instead of just themselves. Okay, so design weights are wonderful things. However, they don't reflect what happens in reality. So the design weight here, if we go back to this example, let's just look at the rural setting. So 50 people or 50 households, whatever it is, 50 businesses, were supposed to respond to this. And but maybe not all of them did. So for example, let's say our response rate, it's always easiest for me to say a half. Let's say 25 of the 100 responded. If we left the design weight as our final weight, then if we multiply those 25 units that replied by 2, it would seem like we only had 50 rural units. So we can't do that. We have to adjust the numbers to take into account the missing values. And I'm going to show some examples of this a little bit later. So non-response adjustment, it's based on the assumption that non-respondents are like our respondents for the characteristics measured in the survey. So this is a big if. We tend to sort of minimize this when it comes to statistics, but what we do is we'll try to take the reweighting, we'll try to take the values from small subpopulations. So if we can do reweighting within a neighborhood, it's better to do reweighting within a neighborhood than to say reweighting within an entire city. This goes back to the presentation on imputation that I did last week. So it may be that the only thing we know about the respondents, because they didn't respond, these non-respondents, I should call them, the only thing we know about these non-respondents is that they live in a certain neighborhood. So we can say, okay, if we were supposed to interview 5 households in a certain neighborhood and we only interviewed 4, let's adjust the weights of those 4 to represent that 5th one that's missing. So that's what we're going to do. Yeah, and so what we do is we just have to multiply by this non-response adjustment factor. And this has to be done obviously after collection. We have to know the number of households that we missed. So let's take a look at this. So the weight adjustment for complete non-response, it's just the sum of the design weights. So all of the design weights that we should have had divided by the sum of the design weights and the responding units. We see in the second part here, for equal probability sample designs, this is the same as saying it's the number of units in the original sample divided by the number of responding units. Okay, so, and then at the end, we multiply this design weight by the non-response adjustment factor. And I'll show this on the next slide. So suppose that we had a population of 500 and we were supposed to sample 50 units. Again, I like to talk in people. So we're supposed to sample 50 people amongst 500. The probability of selection is 1 in 10 because we're selecting 50 of the 100. So the design weight is 1 over this probability, so the inverse, which gives us 10. So this means that each person that answers represents 10 other people if everyone answers. So we take any one of those people that answer, they represent themselves and 9 others. But we have some non-response. So suppose that the number of respondent units is actually 40. So we look down at the bottom here and we see that our design weight of 10, we just have to multiply it by this factor, which is the number of units that should have replied, which was 50, divided by the number of units which did reply, which is 40. And we get this factor of, it comes out to 12 and a half. So the 50 over 40 gives us 1.25. We multiply that by 10, we get 12 and a half. So now each person that responds represents themselves and 11 and a half other people. It seems weird to have fractional weights, but when we add them all up, we get back to our original value of 500. So if we multiply 40 by 12 and a half, this will give us 500. Here's an example with non-response with unequal weighted designs. So this one's trickier. Again, this is where we have to keep track of every single unit. So this one only has 3 units that are being sampled amongst population of 28. The design weights for these units are 12, 10, and 6. We don't really care what method we use to get there. We just need to know that this is what we have. Unit 3 refuses to participate. So we're losing this 6. So the sum of the design weights, 12 and 10 and 6, give us 28, which gets us back to our original population, which is what we're trying to do. But the sum of the design weights of the responding units is only 22. So if we did analysis on this, we would always say, of our population of 22 businesses, let's say, these are the following answers. And people would say, but there are 28 businesses in this population. This is why we have to adjust their weights up to make them represent the 28. And we see down in the table below, we just have to inflate by this factor of 1.2727 because that's the 28 over 26. And so when we multiply their design weights by this factor of 1.2727, we now have that the new weight is 15.27 and 12.73. So when we add these together, we get 28, which is back to our original population, which is what the whole point of weighting is for. So this is how it works with non-response. Now, this is where things get interesting, at least interesting for me. So what do we do without a scopes? So I'm using an example here. Suppose we had a sample of 10,000 amongst a population of 100,000. So let's say you live in a country that has 100,000 households living in it, and you draw a sample of 10,000. Each record has a design weight of 10, so we sampled 10,000 amongst 100,000. But we're missing 500 records due to non-response. And if we are missing 500 records due to non-response, we'd be missing 5,000 people from our estimation. I said household, but obviously on this slide I'd said people. So then we'd have our total sum would only be 95,000. Okay, so we'd have 5% non-response. But we just talked about the fact we would want to have to adjust these weights. If this is truly non-response, if we inflate all of the weights by 1 over 0.95, then we'll get back to our original population of 100,000. This isn't the same as out of scopes. So suppose we have a scenario now where we have out of scopes, 5% out of scopes. This means that we, in one out of every 20 in our sample was not what we expected. So suppose, again, I prefer to do a household survey because it's easier to explain out of scopes. Suppose we had, we drew 1,000 addresses and we found out that in 5% of the cases, they weren't actually households, they weren't homes, they were businesses. We actually want to reduce the estimate of our population by 5% or 5,000. So we don't want to reweight this. The out of scope gives us the correct new estimate, which is our population, the number of households is 95,000. because in our estimate of that 100,000, 5% of them were wrong. 5% of them were businesses. So we actually think now that there are 95,000 households in this community. So for non-response, we want to adjust and inflate to get back up to the original value. With out of scopes, it's giving us an indication. It's sort of like a quality check. We're going into the sample, and instead of checking 100,000 addresses to see which are businesses and which are households, we're doing a quality check by drawing a certain sample and then verifying those. That verification, the failure rate within that, which is 5%, we reduce our original estimate for the size of our population by 5%. So we would only want to inflate up to 95,000 here. Okay, so let's have a quick look here. So again, I've gone back to the same example where we have a population of 500 and the number of units in the original sample is 50. So again, it's the same example. The probability of being selected is 1 in 10. The design weight is 10. And so we have 40 respondent units. But amongst the amongst those that didn't answer, out of scope units, we have 5 of them. So we managed to contact 5 of the missing 10 units, and they said, no, we're businesses, we're not households. We shouldn't be, well, we would say you shouldn't be in our survey. So now what we're going to do is we're going to adjust the design weight, which was 10, by a non-response adjustment, and it's going to be the number of units that should have replied, which is now 45, and then divided by this number 40, which is the number of units that did reply. So all we've changed to add this out of scope adjustment is we adjust the original sample, which was 50, we knock it down to 45. A way that an example I like to give of this is imagine you have an interviewer and you say, here's your 50 interviews you have to go do. And they go out and they do 45 interviews and they come back and they say, I've completed 45 interviews, but 5 of them are out of scope. You wouldn't then turn around to you would say to the interviewer, you have completed 100% of possible interviews. You've done everything you possibly can. You wouldn't say to them, you have a 45 out of 50 response rate, which is 90, because they've come back and they've told you five of these were not eligible to the survey, and that's why they didn't conduct the interview. So if we take a look at this now and we multiply our 40 respondent units by 11.25, we see that we get 450, which is our new estimate of the total population, because we found within our sample, 5 of the 50 or 10% were out of scope. So we want to take 10% off our original estimate of the population, which was 500. So now when we're doing our estimates, we want it to total to 450 instead of 500. All right. We've done our design weights. We've done our non-response and out of scope adjustments. Now we have these final weights. I always like to make the joke that whenever I see a file that says final, it always says something like final weights _ final one _ update _ final for real this time, or something like that. We now have final weights, but we may also be able to do some adjustments if we have some auxiliary information. What does this mean? It means that we may know something about the population that's out there, and we may be able to check of our respondent units, how close was it to the population we're trying to get. So for example, I had the case happen to me once on a survey we were conducting. We randomly sampled households, but then once we started talking to the respondents inside the households, we accidentally biased towards having more women answer the survey than men. So the way that it was designed was, if there was contact made in the household, we would interview the person. We would randomly select within the household and we would interview the person. If we didn't make contact, we would leave a card for them to call us back. But the callback percentage was extremely low. And what we found was there were a lot more women home during the day than men. They were looking after children. They were working from home. For whatever reason, there were more women at home during the day than men. So when we got the final results, the weighted results, we saw that this population appeared to be 60% women and 40% men, which was absolutely wrong. We had the census data. We knew that this neighborhood was about 50% men and 50% women. So if we had published these results, people would have said, well, this isn't right. You're showing that you have a lot more women living in this neighborhood when we know it's not true. And The problem was we had accidentally biased the responses by oversampling, over interviewing women. So that was a problem. Luckily, because we had the census information, we could then do this weight adjustments using auxiliary information. So I'm going to show you how this works. There's a bunch of different ways we can do it. So post stratification, this is sort of my favorite method. It's very easy. So we take age and sex counts, and we just make the adjustments so that the sample that we've drawn, the weighted sample that we've drawn, then matches the distribution for the age sex distribution that we know from from whatever administrative source, whether it be census or some other administrative data, whatever source we have for it. And we're going to see some examples of this coming up. We can also do a ratio estimation where there's some sort of counts and they do ratio estimates corresponding to post stratification. So the weights of the record in the classification groups are adjusted by a multiplication factor. There's some more complex methods, such as calibration and generalized regression. I'm not going to get into these, but just know that there are different methods for adjusting adjusting your final weights using auxiliary information. So the way this post-stratification adjustment works is we have the number of units in the population, the post-stratum, so it could be males under 25, divided by the estimated number of the population units in that. So from census, we have a certain estimate for the number of males under 25 in a given area. We have our results and we can look at it from our final weights and be like, okay, that's a little bit off. And then we just make this final weight now, the non-response adjusted weights multiplied by this post-stratification adjustment factor. So I'm going to do a quick overview of how we do this calculation of weights. So first we calculate the design weight, which is 1 divided by the probability of selection. Then we do this design weight times our non-response, should say non-response and out of scope adjusted weights. And then the final weight, if we have this ability, it's the non-response adjusted weights multiplied by this post-stratification adjustment factor. So let's take a look at these in a couple of slides. First, I'm going to talk a bit more about notation. So when we have lowercase letters attached to our variables, this is just the ith responding unit in the sample. So for example, our first respondent will be, the weight for the first respondent would be W sub 1. The value of interest, let's say we're looking at income, would be Y sub 1. So that's how we do this. The second respondent will be W sub 2 or Y sub 2. So what kind of estimation can we do? There's all sorts of estimates we can calculate, right? So we can take a look at the total number of units. So we're just summing the weights over all the responding units. If you have a column of weights and you sum that, which I've been doing in previous examples, that'll get you back to the total. We may want to estimate the total value of something. So we may want to multiply the weight of each unit by the value of each unit. So for example, let's say I represent 32, let's say it's age sex, male is my age, and we look at my income and I multiply that, we'd multiply that by 32 to get an estimate of my representation of the total for that group. If we were to take Tracy, we would take her weight as a woman, whatever age Tracy is, multiplied by whatever her salary is, and then we could look at the totals based on that. We can calculate average values, obviously, divided by the total number of units, or we can look at proportion of units. So the sum of the weights over the units having a certain characteristic divided by another estimate of the total number of units. And obviously we can do subdomains. So that's what I was talking about by looking at age sex groups. You can isolate so that you have certain values, certain totals for certain whatever domain it is that you're trying to look for. Okay, let's get into some examples. So here we have a survey of smoking habits of employees in a small company. So at the design step, we didn't have any auxiliary information. So we just went ahead and did our survey. We decided to use simple random sampling. So we decided we're going to do a sample of 25. So we're going to draw a sample of 25. We knew that at this company, there were 78 employees. So we just randomly selected 25 amongst the 78. Amongst the 25 people we attempted to interview, 15 of them responded. So if we look at the probability of selection, the original probability of selection was this 25 divided by 78, which is 0.32 or 32%. And if we take a look at the design weight, It's 1 divided by 0.32 or 3.12. So if we now did this, we multiplied 3.12 times 25, we get back to 78. We also collected the sex of each respondent. So this is what the first table would look like. So if your respondent unit, so 1 through 15, we collected their sex, male and female. Do they smoke, yes or no? Then we have these design weights. Everyone has the same design weight because it's a simple random sample. And we have this non-response adjustment factor because we missed 10 of the respondents. We only got 15 of our 25. So we have to boost this up by 67%. When we do this, we get 5.21. If we multiply 5.21 by 15, we'll get back to our population, which is 78. Now, suppose that the information, the auxiliary information becomes available after the survey. So we couldn't stratify on population before the survey was done. We could only do it afterwards. So we create this post strata, we call it, on sex. So now what they do is, you'll see in the very last column, they just separated this into males and females. And we see this sort of reinforces it. There's very few males that answered our survey. The females working at this, well, actually, it may be proportional. We have looked at it. There are 42 men and 36 women. So there's slightly more men. But when we look at our results, very few men answered the survey. So if we were to do the estimates based on just this, we would say there's many women that work at this company and very few men. And that would be absolutely wrong. Something potentially went wrong, or just by random chance or the behaviors of the males in this company, we ended up with this distribution of respondents. So unweighted, this is the results we get. So if we look at the sort of the second column with men, there was 1 smoker and 2 non-smokers for a total of 3. On the women's side, there were 7 smokers, 5 non-smokers for a total of 12. So if we look at the last column, in this company, we counted from these 15 people, this is descriptive statistics, there were 8 smokers and 7 non-smokers amongst the 15 people that answered our survey. However, if we go down under this table now we can start doing inferential statistics where we're doing estimates on the population. So 5.21 is the weight. If we multiply this by 3, which is the number of males, we get that the value is 16. So we're estimating that there's 16 males in this company. For the number of women, we estimate that there's 63. So this gets us up to 69, which is slightly higher than our the estimates for the business, which was only 78. But that's because of rounding. So if we look at the estimated number of men who smoked, we round these numbers. We would say there's approximately 5. Well, we'd say there's 5. The estimated number of women who smoke is 36. The proportion of men who smoke is 0.33. The proportion of women who smoke is 0.58. So this is what the table would look like now. So if we look at the bottom row, the estimated proportion of smokers is 0.33 for men and 0.58 for women. And when we take this total by using the total column, we get that 0.53 or 53% of the company is smokers. Now, we now know that this isn't true. There's a lot more men at this company, and so we need to adjust this. We've over responded from women, so we reduced their weights by 0.58 or multiplied by 0.58. And then for men, we have to multiply by 2.69. And what we see is the new adjusted final weights for women is 3.02, and the new adjusted final weights for men is 14.01. And when we take a look at this table, so the estimated number of men that work at this company is now 42, and the estimated number of women that work at this company is 36, which is exactly we know this is true. They've given us this answer. So what we're doing is we're adjusting our weights to make sure that the estimates we're giving match exactly what's in the population. This survey didn't start out to estimate the number of people working at the company. The company already knows there's 78 people working there. What the company wanted to know is how many people smoke in this company, what are the proportions? We now see, if we look at this, that with these new weights, it doesn't change the proportion of smokers within each of the male and female categories, men and women, because all of their weights got adjusted by the same amount. Each of the men's weights here got adjusted by 2.69. So when we get to this weight of 14, we still get that 0.33 or 33% of men smoke. And we still have that 58% of the women are smokers. However, we now see that overall in the company, 45% of people smoke. So I put these two tables beside each other. The proportion of men and women who smoke stay the same. What happens is we adjust for the fact that we know there's more men working in this company. In this company, it happens that less men smoke. So the overall estimate of the smoking rate goes down from 0.53, which is before we adjusted for the sex distribution of the company, down to 0.45. All right. So now that's the end of weighting. So we had our design weights, we have our non-response and out-of-scope adjustments, and then we also have this, if we have it, we get to do these adjustments for auxiliary data that we have. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes we just have to go with what we have. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the presentation for about 20 minutes or so is to talk about outliers. So an outlier, so we've got all the weights, now we have our values, now we can start doing analysis if we want. However, sometimes what we're going to see is that there's these outlier values. And sometimes this can really mess with the results that we're trying to calculate, and we need to deal with that. So this can be detected in many, many different ways. So it can be detected by doing graphical observations. Sometimes you'll see people do plots where they can see outliers in the graphs. And sometimes they do measurement distances. There's lots of different ways you can calculate outliers. So Tracy, I think this might be the spot where we have the first question. What do we want to do with outliers in our data? There's a varied answers, right? So what should we do? A lot of people say take them out, which is often true. We should adjust for them. Here's the problem with outliers, and all of these answers are sort of correct. And the issue at hand is what's driving our outliers? Where is the outlier coming from? Is the outlier coming from the fact that it's a true data point, or is it erroneous? And this is something we have to dig deeper into to find out which is true. So sometimes taking them out is the right idea. If we have erroneous outliers, 100% of the time we take them out. So in Canada, all of our businesses have an 8-digit business number. I have frequently seen administrative files come to us where the 8-digit business number happened to end up in the income file for that month. So it looks like some of these, mom and pop corner stores are making like tens of millions of dollars a month, which, why did that not advance? Which obviously isn't true. Okay, so if we leave them in, we might lose some precision. So we might have it so that we have these values that maybe shouldn't be there, or maybe are really skewing our results. If we take them out, we might bias our results because it's possible that the value is actually supposed to be there. So again, we might be able to use some other information to deal with the fact that we have these values. And I want to talk about this a little bit more. So suppose we have a small town, at least a small town by Canadian standards, and suppose that the average household the average household income last year was $30,000. One family moves out, and their household income is $30,000. What effect does them moving out have on the average? So in this case, they would stay the same. So because this family happened to earn exactly what the average was, they would have no effect. Them moving out of the neighborhood would have no effect. So imagine, for example, if we had 3 families, one made 20,000, one made 30,000, and one made 40,000. The average of those 3 would be 30,000. But if we remove the $30,000 family, and we have one family making 20,000 and one family making 40,000, the average of those are still 30,000, because this family that was exactly on the average doesn't change the value. So there's no effect from them moving out. So once they've moved out, because they made exactly the average, which is obviously sort of convoluted and I've made it up, then it has no effect on this. Okay, so it has no effect. Now, a new family moves in. They make $10 million a year. I meant to look this up before I presented this. The number of families in Canada making $10 million a year, I could probably count on my fingers. Maybe there's more than that. Well, there's a lot of, I guess it's professional athletes, I think, that'd be driving this one. There are families that make this. It's extremely uncommon. I I can't imagine I know anyone who makes this much money. Anyways, so new family moves in, they make $10 million. This is a huge outlier in many different ways. Okay. What is, oh man, there, I spelled there incorrectly. What is their effect on the average? So remember, the population is 1,000 households. We move someone in who's making $10 million. So what's their effect on the average? Overall, we've got this correct. So it goes up by about 10,000. And I'm comfortable with people saying the average goes up, but we don't know by how much, because that 30,000 is going to affect it as well. So really, we had to subtract the 30,000 from 10 million, but the 30,000 and the 10 million doesn't make much of a difference. So it's a hand wave by about 10,000. So yeah, thank you for answering that. So this family has moved in to a small little community, small for us, 1,000 households, and they make $10 million. So the income here is going up, and the average income is going up by a lot. Okay, so it's gone up from roughly 30,000 to 40,000. So I wrote down at the bottom here that the analysts at, wherever StatsCan or universities get super excited because they found this community where the average income rose. That's embarrassing. The average income rose 33% 1 year. Shame on me for saying 25%. It's 33%. So here's the problem. This family really makes that much money. So this family has moved into this neighborhood or this small town, and they've made this much money. So it's going to cause us a bit of grief, because the average income in this community actually did go up by 10,000, about 10,000. It went up to about 40,000. So let's look at some ways we can mitigate this. So how does this household arriving affect the median income? And let's assume there's a lot of households that make about $30,000. So now we're looking at median income instead of average income. Because I said there's a lot of families making about 30,000, it likely wouldn't affect the median income, because what happens is we took out a family who was making the median income, and then we added one on the higher side. So when we rank them, there's still a good chance we'll have a family that's 30,000. Now, that might not, it might go up, it might not, and we may not know, because again, if the next family in order made, say, 31,000, then the median went up by 1,000. But if there's a bunch of them at 30,000, excuse me, it's likely that it didn't go up. So thank you for answering that. Okay, so it likely won't. So again, we don't know. So average is called a non-robust estimator. As soon as you have one outlier, which is our $10 million family, it ruins the estimate. Okay, so you add in any value, the average changes. Median is considered a very robust estimator. At the minimum, half of your observations plus one need to be an outlier before the median moves. So I gave some examples here with this 30,000. If we had these families that are making 0, 20, 30, 30, 50, 250, or we have minus 10,000, 20, 30, 30, 100, 2.5 million, 10 million, the median is still going to be 30,000. So the median is very robust. It doesn't move when there's outliers. So there's many different types of robust estimators out there. Average, people like to talk in averages because it's easy to calculate. So you take the total of something, you divide it by the number of people, and then you get your average. Most statistical agencies calculate medians, because the median income just tells you what's the middleth income in your neighborhood or in your city, your country, whatever it is. The 10 million doesn't really affect it, right? So if all of a sudden we have this rich family move in, it doesn't affect our median. And we don't really want the median to move because it's just one family. So which is true? They're both true. Okay, so the average did go up by 10,000, and the median in the example that I gave didn't move. So the median income in this neighborhood is still 30,000. The average income is now 40,000 when it was originally 30,000, assuming that the median and average were the same before. So there's several ways we can deal with this. And this goes back to the first poll question I think we had, where I said, what do we want to do with the outliers? One of the things we can do is we can trim it. So we can take the top and bottom either number or percent, remove them. So for example, you may take out the 1% highest and lowest household incomes if you still want to calculate averages. In median, if you took out the highest and lowest 1%, it wouldn't affect it at all because you're removing from each of the sides of the middle. So it doesn't affect it at all. There's another one that we use, and this one's interesting. It's called Windsorization. There was some Mr. Windsor that invented this one. And so what you do here is you cap the value. So the family moves in, they're making $10 million a year. Your analysts, your experts, your economists that are working on this survey may say that above an income of $1.5 million a year, which is an incredibly large amount of money, there's no effect on the local economy. So if someone moves in that's making $1.5 million, maybe new cars are getting purchased, maybe new things are getting built. But if you add that income, if the income then goes up to $2.5 million, it doesn't change. All of the money that they make over this $1.5 million are going outside of the community. They're investing this in other businesses. They're doing other things with it. So everyone with a value of over $1.5 million just gets set to $1.5 million. And you have to put this in your results that this is what you're doing. So the median is 30,000, and this new Windsorized average goes up to 31,500. And this sometimes is a good statistics to use because it shows that there was a change in the community. If someone who's making $10 million a year moves into a small community, there probably is going to be a knock-on effect. So they are going to be spending more locally than was being spent before. And those people in the community are going to be slightly richer because of it. So the person that owns the corner store near this person's house is super lucky. The person who's selling luxury cars is extremely lucky because it might be their first sell ever. So there is some sort of economic change happening based on the fact that this family moved in. So outliers are really tricky to deal with, and it's very important to put in your analysis how you're dealing with them. So you can eliminate them, you can leave them in. Adjusting them is a very good idea though. And also when we use robust estimators, again, like the median, we can leave our outliers in, but it doesn't change the estimate that we're making. So that's basically what I want to talk about. So it's 11:54 now. We've covered a lot of material. So we talked about weighting and estimates, which is really important. And then I finished up there with outliers, which I think is also very important to talk about.